When Dale Hartwell fired single father Silas Bennett, he announced that 12 elite specialists would replace what he called an outdated mechanic. Before the full board of directors, Silas was forced to surrender his employee badge and watch the Helios 9 engine 8 years of his life be handed over to the new team. Dale ordered an immediate startup demonstration to prove his decision was justified. 1 minute passed, then 5. The control screens turned red. The turbine sat motionless, and a $2.1 billion contract stood on the edge of collapse. But Silas, already being escorted out, had quietly noticed a single silver ring turned the wrong way. If you want to watch arrogance finally pay its price, subscribe and follow every twist of Silas's reversal. The Hartwell Advanced Systems facility stretched across a sprawling industrial campus on the outer edge of the city, its testing bays humming around the clock, its hallways carrying the permanent smell of machine oil and pressurized coolant. Its reputation built over decades on contracts that moved government money and restructured energy infrastructure for entire regions. At the center of that facility sat a single prototype designated Helios 9, a hybrid turbine system unlike anything on the commercial market, capable of powering a full district through an emergency grid failure, sustaining output for extended periods without external resupply, and doing so at a cost efficiency no rival design had come close to matching. That engine was not the product of a boardroom idea or a research grant administered from a comfortable distance. It was the product of 8 years of daily presence of a man named Silas Bennett, who had bent over that machine before sunrise and after midnight, who had cataloged its failures with obsessive precision, and who had developed an understanding of its behavior that no document in any filing cabinet fully captured. Silas was 39 years old, a black single father raising his daughter on his own, who kept his personal life quiet and his professional life loud in the only way that mattered, through results no one could argue with. He had grown up in a household where the unspoken rule was that a black man in a technical field carried the burden of proving himself twice over, and he had long ago made peace with that reality by deciding that the work itself would be his only argument. Through a machine that had slowly come alive under his hands, through a record of diagnostic accuracy that had saved the prototype from catastrophic failure on at least 3 separate occasions in the past 2 years alone, he arrived at the facility before 5 in the morning on the day before the scheduled performance demonstration, wearing the same worn work trousers and steel-capped boots he always wore, moving through the empty testing bay with the economy of someone who had done this hundreds of times and had no interest in performing the ritual for any audience. He ran his fingers along the compressor housing, checked the heat exchange manifold by feel, and then stood quietly beside the 3rd combustion chamber and listened to what the machine had to say about itself that morning. What he heard was not alarming to an untrained ear and would not have registered as meaningful on a standard inspection checklist, but to Silas it carried a precise and specific weight. A micro-oscillation in the compression zone, faint and rhythmic, the kind of vibration that appeared in acoustic logs as barely a tremor, but that he recognized as the early signature of a calibration drift accumulating under thermal load. He wrote it down, cross-referenced it against 6 weeks of prior data, and filed a morning report to senior management with a clear and unambiguous recommendation: 3 additional days of thermal adjustment before any commercial load test could be safely authorized. The subject line of his report read simply, "Do not proceed until cleared." Dale Hartwell read the report from his office on the 42nd floor, where the windows overlooked a skyline that had nothing to do with turbines or calibration tolerances, and everything to do with the version of success that is measured in contract values and quarterly projections. The performance demonstration was scheduled for the following morning. Aurora Grid Consortium's representatives were already in the city, and the contract had taken 19 months and considerable political effort to bring to this point. Dale marked the report low priority without replying. scheduled an all-hands meeting for that afternoon under a subject line that gave nothing away and let the morning pass without forwarding Silas's findings to anyone else on the leadership team. When Silas received the meeting invitation, no agenda, no other names listed a time slot that overlapped with his afternoon calibration session. He changed nothing about his day, locked his handwritten calibration notes in the gray cabinet beside his workbench, and walked toward the elevator without the faintest suspicion that he was walking toward the last hour of his employment at the company. He had no way of knowing that 12 new engineers had been checked into the company's guest suites overnight, that their access credentials were already active in the internal directory, or that Dale Hartwell had spent the better part of 2 weeks building a narrative in which Silas was not the architect of Helios 9, but its captor. The conference room on the 40th floor had glass walls on 3 sides, and through one of them you could see straight down into the testing bay where Helios 9 sat under its overhead service lights. Dale had chosen the room deliberately wanting the board and whoever else was present to be able to look at the engine while he made his case. 12 strangers occupied one side of the long table when Silas entered. Men and women in pressed shirts and dark jackets, some of them with institutional credentials already displayed on the slide deck behind them, all of them watching Silas with expressions that ranged from professional neutrality to the studied detachment of people who have been told they are walking into a situation someone else has already resolved. Dr. Owen Prescott led the group, 44 years old, quiet, in the way that genuinely capable people tend to be quiet, with a portfolio of industrial engine projects on 4 continents, and the kind of academic record that fills an entire slide on its own. Dale introduced them without ceremony, described their combined qualifications in terms that were technically accurate and contextually designed to stand in unfavorable contrast to the man sitting across from them, and then made his formal accusation with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed it enough times to deliver it without visible discomfort. The allegation was that Silas had turned Helios 9 into a personal domain that he had deliberately withheld operational knowledge to make himself indispensable, and that he had systematically complicated systems that a competent engineering team should have been able to manage without him. Dale offered no documentation to support any of this and did not appear to consider that a problem because the confidence with which he stated things had always functioned in his experience as a reasonable substitute for evidence. What Dale was doing in that room was not simply firing an employee. He was doing what people in positions of unchecked authority have always done when they feel threatened by someone they cannot fully control. He was rewriting the story before anyone else had the chance to tell it. And the version he was writing had no room for a black man from a regional technical school being the most indispensable person in the building. When Silas attempted to present his morning report, explain what the compression chamber oscillation meant for the planned startup timeline, Dale picked up the printed document, moved it to the far side of a water glass, and said that a machinist who had graduated from a regional technical school had no basis for lecturing a room full of doctoral engineers about equipment they had not yet had the opportunity to examine. The room was quiet, in the specific way rooms go quiet when someone has said something that cannot be unsaid. And Silas looked at the table for a moment and then looked up. He addressed Owen Prescott directly rather than Dale because Owen was the person in the room who would actually be responsible for the engine. And he asked a single technical question. Had the handover documentation included the thermal recalibration annex, Owen answered with the candor of someone who had not been told there was anything to conceal. His team had received several thousand pages of schematics and general specifications, but he had seen no document fitting that description. Silas absorbed that answer without expression because it told him precisely what he needed to know about what information the new team had been given, and more importantly, what had been withheld from them. He looked at Dale and said, without raising his voice, that before anyone attempted to start the engine, someone needed to verify the silver alignment ring near the pressure equalization valve and confirm its orientation had not been disturbed. Dale said the time for gatekeeping was finished. He signaled the security officer near the door. Silas surrendered his badge, his workstation access card, and the cabinet key without resistance or a word, and was escorted through the building by a guard who could not quite meet his eyes in the elevator and who walked slightly faster than necessary as though speed made the task less uncomfortable for both of them. Before he reached the exit, Silas paused at the glass that looked down into the bay. He could see Helios 9 from there, lit and motionless, surrounded now by engineers who did not yet know what they did not know. He said quietly that an engine did not belong to the person who spoke the loudest in the room above it, and that it would only respond to someone who understood what it required. Then he walked out, the door closed, and the building moved forward without him, and 12 engineers filed down the stairs toward a machine that had spent 8 years learning one man's patience. There is something worth holding on to here. When the work is real and the knowledge is genuinely yours, no one can take the most important part of it with them when they escort you out the door. What Silas carried out of that building, no badge or cabinet key could ever represent. Owen Prescott approached Helios 9 with the structure and discipline that distinguished him from less careful people. Team, divided by specialization documentation, reviewed by function timeline, established with buffer margins, and a reasonable working assumption that a well-maintained prototype from a facility of this reputation would yield its operational logic within a single working day. This assumption began to erode within the first 90 minutes. The engine's architecture combined pressure regulation, thermal management, and vibration compensation into a continuous self-balancing loop that had no analog in any commercial turbine framework any of them had previously worked within. Not because Silas had designed it to be obscure, but because the problem it was solving was genuinely novel, and the solution had evolved through years of iterative correction rather than clean theoretical derivation. There were no isolated subsystems to diagnose in isolation, because every subsystem communicated with every other, and interventions applied to one propagated through the rest in ways that the schematic drawings suggested but declined to fully explain. The documentation the team had received was extensive in volume and wholly inadequate in practice. Thousands of pages of design drawings, material specifications, and control architecture with nothing describing the engine's actual behavioral signature under live operating conditions, nothing capturing the acoustic profile at various load levels, and nothing explaining the self-protection logic that Silas had spent years mapping through failures he had personally caused, documented, and learned from. Dale gave them 6 hours when Owen requested an extension and explained that the available documentation did not cover the engine's operational envelope with sufficient precision to allow a safe startup. Dale reminded him of the figure on the contract and repeated the requirement. The demonstration was proceeding in the morning, and a team that could not prepare an unfamiliar engine in one day was not the team he was paying for. Owen divided the remaining time as efficiently as he could, assigning the compressor system to one subgroup, the thermal controls to another, and the electrical management to a third. All of them working from the available materials and from the collective experience they had brought into the room, relying on the reasonable professional assumption that careful methodical analysis would close the gaps that the missing documentation had left open. One of the engineers, experienced, methodical, and without any context for the decision he was making, found the silver alignment ring near the pressure equalization valve and studied it carefully before touching it. It was small, perhaps 4 centimeters in diameter, marked in pencil with a directional notation that did not correspond to the factory standard position printed in the main assembly schematic. He held the schematic beside the component for a long moment, concluded that the handwritten mark was a legacy note from an earlier prototype revision, and rotated the ring to align it with what the official drawing specified. The correction was made in less than 10 seconds and seemed entirely logical given what he knew. What he did not know, because the document that would have told him had been removed from the handover archive, was that the ring's apparent misalignment was not a mistake. It was a deliberate offset that Silas had developed to compensate for a resonance characteristic specific to Helios 9's combustion geometry. A compensation that only made sense in the context of data that no longer existed in any document the team had access to. The engine registered the change immediately in the way that systems register, changes they cannot reconcile, not with an alarm, but with the quiet internal decision to stop trusting its own sensors. Mara Ellison caught the sensor desynchronization in the pre-start diagnostic and flagged it within minutes, recommending that all further preparation be halted until the root cause could be identified and assessed. Dale was summoned to the bay, listened to her explanation, and dismissed it without examination, informing her that a quality assurance specialist's function was to record outcomes rather than to second-guess the collective judgment of 12 engineers whose combined credentials exceeded most university faculties. Mara noted his response in her logbook and said nothing further because there was nothing further to say to someone who had already decided. The team completed the pre-start checklist, configured the monitoring board, and made the first startup attempt with the particular discipline of professionals who have done everything they know how to do and are about to discover that it is not enough. The engine powered up in the way that always looks promising from a distance. The control panel lit in sequence. The primary compressor began to rotate, and for 3 seconds, the bay filled with the low vibration of a large machine coming to life. Then it stopped. Not with any dramatic indication of malfunction, not with an alarm or an impact, but with the particular silence of a system that had evaluated its internal conditions and determined according to its own logic that continuing was not something it was prepared to do. The diagnostic screen populated with an error sequence that the team spent the next 40 minutes searching for in the official documentation before accepting that the codes were not there. They were part of Silas's personal behavioral notation, a shorthand he had developed over years of testing that translated specific engine states into language the factory manual had never anticipated and never included. Because the factory manual had been written for a different machine. The team attempted 6 distinct recovery approaches over the following hours, each one methodical and each one insufficient. They restored the management software from a clean backup, replaced 2 of the pressure sensors with matched units from the spare inventory, rebalanced the fuel injection timing, ran a complete electrical circuit diagnostic, reloaded the engine control operating system from its original image, and then met and decided on a 6th approach that combined elements of the previous attempts in a configuration that made theoretical sense. Each time, Helios 9 activated for a few seconds and then locked itself again, returning the same sequence of diagnostic codes and the same resolute silence consistent enough across attempts to confirm that this was not a random malfunction, but a systematic response to something specific that all their expertise and all their available instruments could not clearly identify from the outside. The pattern had the quality of a message not hostile, not designed, just present from a machine that had been built over 8 years to protect itself from exactly this kind of situation. Dale's composure degraded over the course of the afternoon in the incremental way that composure degrades in people who have spent their careers avoiding accountability. He stopped using measured language and began issuing demands, the particular kind that substitute raised volume for authority and reveal in the substitution that the genuine article has run out. He required that the protective lock sequence be bypassed entirely, that the team write a manual override, allowing the startup to proceed regardless of what the internal sensors reported, and he made this requirement in the voice of someone who had decided that the safety architecture was a personal affront rather than a technical necessity. Owen refused because bypassing a multi-layered safety lock on a prototype worth several $100 million with no understanding of why the lock had engaged was not a risk that any engineer with professional standing could authorize. Dale threatened the contract, threatened their individual reputations, and then announced that Silas had clearly embedded a hidden interference mechanism before his departure, that this was sabotage by a disgruntled former employee, and that criminal charges were forthcoming. Silas was 40 minutes away in a small house with a kitchen table sized for 2 people. The photos on the wall were the kind a single father puts up when a daughter grows fast, and the years need to be held somewhere visible. He set his old badge on the counter when he came in and did not pick it up again, and he did not answer most of the calls that came through in the hours that followed. One call that he did take was short. and came from his daughter, who asked whether he would be home for dinner. He told her that today he had simply finished one kind of work, that he had not lost anything essential to who he was, and that he would be home. He did not sound entirely certain, but he said it clearly, and she told him she would set the table. Across the city, the 9th startup attempt ended the same way the first 8 had, and Owen stood beside the silent turbine and looked at the silver ring near the pressure valve and remembered with precise clarity the exact words Silas had spoken on his way out of the building. Dale issued an internal communication before midnight that evening, worded with enough care to avoid naming anyone directly, while leaving no ambiguity about its subject, describing deliberate technical interference by a recently separated employee who had allegedly embedded hidden dependencies in the engine's operating logic before departing. The document reached every department head within the hour, and by morning there was not a person in the facility who did not understand that the allegation concerned Silas Bennett. Additional measures followed. All of Silas's facility access accounts were locked and audited. His personal engineering notebooks, physical volumes he had left in the gray cabinet beside his workbench, were removed and transferred to the legal department's custody. And the security team began a frame-by-frame review of all testing bay camera footage, working backward from the current date in search of anything that could be shaped into evidence for the narrative Dale needed. What the camera footage contained was not what Dale was looking for. Mara Ellison completed her own review, first working from her personal workstation on the security archive she had accessed before anyone thought to restrict her clearance. And what she found was unambiguous and sequential. The footage from the hours before Silas's departure showed him conducting his standard pre-demonstration check and sending his morning report. The footage from after his escort out of the building showed one of the newly arrived engineers locating the silver alignment ring and rotating it. The timestamp removed any possible ambiguity about the order of events. Mara copied the relevant segments to an encrypted external drive, stored it in her bag, and then reported to the shift supervisor with the kind of professional steadiness that comes from knowing you have the correct information and understanding that what you do with it matters. She did not mention the drive to anyone else that night. Owen had been spending his off hours working through the email archive, reading backward through 8 months of project communications in the methodical way that engineers read data, looking for pattern, not narrative. What he found was not a gap in record-keeping, but an accumulation. 7 separate communications from Silas over the previous 2 years, each one describing in specific technical language the conditions that triggered the engine's deep lock behavior and the recovery sequence required to exit it safely. Each one routed through the CEO's office and marked with the same administrative tag: no action required. He read them in order and then read them again, and by the end he was not reading cautionary correspondence. He was reading a precise technical description of exactly the situation the team was currently unable to resolve. A junior engineer on the team, cross-referencing archive design files, found a reference to something called Annex H9, a thermal resynchronization protocol described as standard handover material for any Helios series project. The annex itself was absent. The server access log explained the absence. Annex H9 had been removed from the handover archive 7 weeks earlier by an administrative command traced to Dale Hartwell's office, with a stated reason recorded in the system as document simplification for client presentation purposes. When Owen presented this finding to Dale directly, the CEO did not deny having authorized the removal. He described the annex as an overcomplicated set of personal notes from an engineer who had a long-standing habit of mystifying straightforward systems to protect his own position. Owen pointed out with precision and without any particular emotion that the document being described as personal mysticism contained the exact recovery procedure the team currently needed to exit the engine's locked state. Dale told him to find a solution with the resources available. Owen said the resources available were insufficient without that procedure. Dale said that engineers who could not work without a single missing document had no business calling themselves an elite team. The conversation ended there. Owen walked to a quiet corridor, took out his phone, and dialed the number listed in the handover briefing under the previous engineer's personal contact. When Silas answered, Owen did not ask for rescue or for any favor beyond information. He asked which direction the silver ring was supposed to face. Silas's answer began not with the ring's orientation, but with the clarification that Owen needed to understand before the orientation mattered at all. The rotation had not simply misaligned one component, it had introduced a false pressure cycle into the engine's thermal memory, and the thermal memory had accepted that false cycle as its new operational baseline. The ring could be returned to the correct position, but doing so without first clearing the false baseline would produce the same lockout on every subsequent startup attempt because the system would continue measuring its actual state against a reference it had learned incorrectly across 9 reinforcing failures. The recovery procedure existed. It had always existed, and it required the kind of environmental and acoustic data that Silas had accumulated over 8 years of live testing. Data that no credential, however genuine, could substitute for on short notice in a single afternoon. Owen thanked him and ended the call and sat with the understanding that his team had not been set up to succeed. They had been positioned as proof of a claim that someone else needed to be true, and the engine had simply declined to cooperate with the arrangement. And that is perhaps the quiet truth at the center of all of this. Institutions can remove a person from a building. They cannot remove what that person has genuinely learned. Knowledge earned through years of patient, honest work has a weight that paperwork and authority cannot redistribute on demand. The kind of integrity Mara showed when she copied that footage onto a personal drive alone at night, with no guarantee of what would come next, is the kind that rarely makes headlines. But it is exactly that kind of quiet courage from people in the middle of organizations that keeps the truth from being buried entirely. If there is something to carry away from the collapse happening inside that facility, it is this: the moment you begin treating the people closest to the work as obstacles rather than sources you have already started losing. The real cost of dismissing expertise is never paid on the day of the dismissal. It comes due later in front of people you cannot afford to disappoint. Rebecca Sloan arrived at the facility the following morning before her scheduled time, accompanied by a 3-person independent verification team whose presence had not been announced to the facility in advance. She was a precise woman of 47 with enough years in infrastructure procurement to have developed accurate instincts about the difference between a demonstration that is proceeding and one that is being managed, and she had reached a provisional conclusion before she reached the lobby. She asked to see the operational log without preamble, read it through without expression, and then set it on the table and asked Dale to explain the 17-hour record of 9 failed startup sequences and the safety parameter entries that appeared to have been retroactively adjusted. Dale offered the explanation he had prepared. A terminated employee had interfered with the system. His legal team was preparing documentation, and the engineering group had identified the source of the problem and was close to resolution. Rebecca asked to see the evidence of interference. Dale said the investigation was ongoing. Rebecca said that an ongoing investigation was not a technical explanation and that her team's continued presence at the facility was contingent on receiving honest and complete information about the engine's current operational status. Owen spoke before Dale could redirect the conversation. He stated in front of Rebecca and her verification team and the board members who had been summoned to observe that there was no evidence of deliberate interference in the engine systems, that the diagnostic record showed the engine responding to a physical misalignment that had occurred after the previous lead engineer's departure, and that the absence of the recovery documentation was a consequence of a decision made at the executive level and confirmed in the server access log. It was the most professionally restrained statement anyone had made in that building in 4 days, and it dismantled Dale's narrative with a thoroughness that left nothing standing. Dale terminated Owen's project role on the spot and turned to the youngest member of the engineering team with an instruction to begin the manual bypass sequence. The young engineer looked at the engine, looked at Dale, and declined. Every other person in the bay declined alongside him. Evelyn Carver called the emergency board session from the observation corridor before the scene in the bay had fully resolved, and she requested the complete Helios 9 development archive, including the original intellectual property agreements from the project's inception. The agreements that came back from the legal department told a story Dale had managed carefully for 3 years. Silas had developed the engine's core technology before joining the company as an employee. Hartwell Advanced Systems held commercial exploitation rights only under the condition that Silas maintained an active technical oversight role. His termination, conducted without the independent technical review that the original agreement specified as a prerequisite, had placed those commercial rights in legal jeopardy. The board required Silas's return. Dale said that bringing him back would constitute a public humiliation of the chief executive. Evelyn said that the humiliation of one person was considerably less expensive than the collapse of the company's largest contract and the potential loss of its rights to the project entirely. Silas arrived the following morning in the same clothes he had worn the day he was escorted out. The worn trousers, the thermal shirt, the boots carrying nothing that looked like a statement, and making no particular effort to be seen. People who had been present when he was fired stood in the corridor when he returned, and several of them stepped aside in a way that was not quite deferential and not quite apologetic, but that acknowledged, in the particular physical grammar of workplaces, that something had been wrong and was now being corrected. There was no triumphant expression on his face, no settling of old scores in his posture. Just a man who had work to return to and who intended to do it. Dale had attempted on the phone to frame the recall as a temporary consulting engagement with conditions Silas could accept or reject. Silas had listened for approximately 45 seconds before interrupting and explaining that he had 3 requirements, not conditions, and that the distinction was not semantic. The first requirement was a formal retraction of the sabotage allegation, written, signed, and read aloud before the board, the engineering team, and Aurora Grid's representatives naming the allegation and confirming it had no evidentiary basis placed in the official record where it would remain accessible. The second requirement was that all technical decisions affecting Helios 9's operational safety would rest with the engineering team and not be subject to executive override, and that this authority structure would be written into the project governance documents before any startup was attempted. The third requirement was that the intellectual contribution records, the patents, the design credits, the contract annexes would accurately reflect the names of everyone who had actually built the technology, including engineers who had contributed to subsystems across the 8 years of development and whose contributions had been absorbed into the institutional record without attribution. Silas did not ask Dale to express remorse. He did not ask to have his previous title restored or to be given anything that resembled a victory ceremony. He asked for accurate records and structural accountability because those were the only things that would prevent the same sequence of events from repeating at some future point when a different version of Dale decided that a different Silas was expendable. Evelyn accepted all 3 requirements in writing within 2 hours. That afternoon, Dale Hartwell stood in the same conference room where he had fired Silas and read a retraction from a printed page in front of the board, the engineering team, and Rebecca Sloan's verification group. And the act of reading it aloud was its own particular consequence. Not a theatrical humiliation, but a quiet, complete inversion of everything he had staged in that room 4 days earlier. When he finished, no one said anything for a moment. Silas walked past him toward the elevator without pausing. He went to Owen first when he reached the bay, not to assert authority, but to conduct a diagnostic interview, asking each member of the team to describe in sequence every adjustment they had made to the engine from the time they took over until the moment he arrived back. He listened with the focused economy of someone translating spoken description into physical understanding in real time, building a map of what had been done and in what order and what the engine had shown in response, each time cross-referencing it against the behavioral patterns he carried not on paper, but in 8 years of accumulated recognition. He was neither dismissive nor generous in his responses. He was technical, and the precision of it, the absence of blame, the presence of method, had an effect on the team that was difficult to describe, but clearly felt as the room's atmosphere shifted from defensive to collaborative. When Owen described the silver ring, Silas said the ring itself was no longer the primary problem. The rotation had introduced a false pressure baseline that had since been reinforced by 9 consecutive failed startup cycles, and the recovery required clearing that baseline without triggering the lockout sequence a 10th time, which meant the approach had to be different from anything the team had tried. Dale appeared in the doorway of the bay twice during the preparation period and asked the same essential question each time in different phrasing. What was the unlock code? He had arrived at a conclusion that was internally coherent, given everything he believed about how expertise worked. That Silas had protected the engine with a proprietary sequence, something hidden that could be extracted, documented, and then rendered independent of the person who had created it. Silas explained both times with complete patience and no sarcasm that there was no such sequence. The engine had no private password, no hidden start mechanism, no back-channel override accessible only to its original designer. What it had was 8 years of empirical records. And what those records required was not someone who could read them, but someone who could read them in relation to what the engine sensors were reporting in real time and understand what the relationship between those two streams of information meant. That understanding was not a secret. It was a consequence of time and attention, and it could be transferred but only slowly, and not in a morning, and not under the conditions Dale had created, by removing the documentation that would have given anyone else a place to start. He opened his personal records, the logs he had retained legally before joining the company, stored on a drive he had brought with him, and distributed 8 years of test data across the bay's workstations. Each entry had a date, an ambient temperature, a fuel mixture ratio, and acoustic readings captured through microphones Silas had installed at his own expense before the facility's monitoring system had been configured to cover the frequencies he cared about. Every failure was cross-referenced against the conditions that had preceded it. Every correct response had a paired counterexample showing what happened when the response was wrong. Annex H9 was in there intact, because Silas had written it before he became the company's employee, and it had never legally been the company's property to remove. He divided the team into 3 working groups and gave each group not a procedure to execute, but a set of observations to gather from the engine in its current locked state. Acoustic readings, thermal profile pressure, differential across the affected valve range to establish a behavioral signature that could be compared against the historical baseline and reveal the specific gap between where the engine believed itself to be and where it actually was. He wanted the team to build the data rather than consume it, because the machine in front of them was not the machine from any archived record. It had been altered by 9 failed cycles and needed to be understood in its present condition before any recovery sequence could be correctly applied. The team worked for 3 hours in a way that was different from how they had worked before Silas arrived. Not more skilled, not less competent, but oriented differently, working with a framework rather than against a mystery. And during those hours, something shifted in the room that none of them would have been able to articulate precisely, but that all of them registered. Mara presented the camera footage and the server access log on the monitor in the secondary control room, with Dale's name already noted in the margin of her report, and the footage showed what it showed without requiring any interpretation. The log confirmed what had been removed from the handover archive and when and by whose authorization. Dale offered the explanation he had prepared. Simplification, streamlining presentation, clarity. And Evelyn set in front of him a document bearing his signature that certified the handover package as complete and fully documented. He looked at it for a moment and did not produce a response. Rebecca gave the facility one final opportunity. If the engine did not reach a stable operational load before midday, Aurora Grid's team would file a non-performance determination and the contract would be void. She said it without drama because she was not there for drama. The bay was quieter than it had any right to be with that many people in it. The observation room above held the board, the verification team, and the legal department's representatives. Owen's engineers occupied their monitoring stations with the focused attention of people who were, for the first time since their arrival at the facility, working from complete information rather than from what Dale had chosen to provide them. Mara sat at the safety monitoring station with her logbook open to a clean page. Silas stood at the main control console and reviewed once more the behavioral signature the team had spent the morning assembling: the acoustic readings, the thermal differential, the pressure offset across the 3 desynchronized sensors, and compared them against the historical baseline from the years when the engine had been healthy, identifying the specific gap between the two and the sequence that would close it without triggering another lockout. He did not run the startup alone. He asked Owen to manage the pressure valve sequence, assigned the compressor monitoring to the 2 engineers who had produced the most careful acoustic work during the morning's data collection phase, and placed Mara's safety readings on the primary display so that every person in the bay could see her numbers in real time. He said once and without elaboration that recovering this engine was not a demonstration of any one person's ability. It was a test of whether the correct process applied by people who now understood it could overcome the damage done by the incorrect process applied under time pressure and incomplete information. Then he began. The auxiliary power stage activated cleanly. The primary compressor began its rotation, and the thermal readings climbed the curve Silas had mapped from 8 years of live data. Not the curve in the official specifications written for standardized ambient conditions, but the actual curve Helios 9 had consistently produced across its operational lifetime, which departed from the specification in 3 specific ways that only mattered under load and that were documented in the annex that had spent the morning restored to the workstations. At the 17-second mark, a red indicator appeared on the safety board. Dale's voice came through the intercom from the observation room. Declarative satisfied, stating that the failure sequence was repeating and requesting that the attempt be logged as a 10th malfunction. Silas did not respond to the intercom. He listened to the compressor's pitch with his eyes partially closed, the way a person listens to something they need to hear accurately rather than simply register, and he identified the source of the red indicator in the same moment. The 3rd pressure sensor was reporting on a half-second delay relative to the system's actual state, and the safety board was triggering on a reading that reflected where the engine had been rather than where it currently was. He did not disable the sensor. He entered a cross-reference command requesting that the system weight the vibration sensor's input alongside the pressure reading before making any lockout determination, a procedure documented in Annex H9 for exactly this diagnostic scenario, and the system accepted the command and recalculated. The red indicator transitioned to amber. The compressor continued to rotate and passed through the rotational band that had ended every previous attempt. The ceramic core temperature reached its minimum operating threshold and held there. The valve sequence Owen was managing stayed within the parameters Silas had specified, and the numbers across the board held their alignment in a way they had not managed in any of the 9 prior attempts. A private instruction reached a maintenance technician in the bay through a handheld communicator. Dale from the observation room requesting that the load be increased manually to accelerate the engine's output curve before the verification team's instruments completed their independent measurement cycle. The technician received the instruction and immediately informed Silas, who relayed it to Mara, who documented it and passed the documentation to the board's representative above. Evelyn stated through the intercom that the chief executive's operational authority had been suspended by the board pending review. When Dale declined to leave the observation room voluntarily, the facility's security lead escorted him out with efficiency and without incident. The transfer of control had not happened in that moment. It had been documented and confirmed days earlier and was simply finally visible. Silas continued. The silver alignment ring was returned to its correct orientation as part of a coordinated sequence that included the thermal memory flush and the valve timing reset that Annex H9 had always specified. and the engine's internal log began rewriting its baseline in real time, replacing the false reference point with measured data from what it was actually experiencing, discarding what it had been incorrectly taught across 9 failed cycles. The compressor reached 30% of rated load, then 60%, then stabilized at 100% with the steadiness of a machine that has finally been given the conditions it was built to require. The lights on the control board transitioned through green in sequence. The test infrastructure connected to Helios 9 showed live power flowing through it for the first time since the team had arrived. No one cheered. Owen crossed the bay and extended his hand and said that his team had arrived at the facility, knowing how turbines worked and that they were leaving with something different, an understanding of why this particular turbine needed to work the way it did. Silas took his hand and said that Helios 9 had taught him the same lesson about 8 years earlier and that he had not stopped learning it since. Rebecca confirmed the test results met the verification standard and then stated that the revised contract would include a provision establishing that the engineering team, not the executive team, held the authority to halt operations whenever safety criteria were not satisfied. Silas agreed to that provision without hesitation. The internal investigation that followed took 11 days and produced a report that was 300 pages long and deeply unflattering to one person in particular. It confirmed that the thermal recalibration annex had been removed from the handover archive by executive directive, that this removal had been concealed from the board, that the sabotage allegation against Silas had been made without evidentiary basis and in direct contradiction of the camera record, and that the pressure applied to the engineering team to bypass safety protocols had exposed the company to significant liability across multiple regulatory frameworks. The board removed Dale Hartwell from the chief executive position without ceremony. He retained his personal equity and his financial standing, and no one in the room pretended that a man of his resources would face consequences proportional to the full scope of what he had done. But he lost the project he had spent 3 years positioning as the centerpiece of his legacy. And he lost the right to describe himself as the man who had brought Helios 9 to market, because the record now said something else and would continue to say something else permanently. Evelyn offered Silas the chief executive role within a week of Dale's removal. He declined it in the way he had always declined things that asked him to leave the work he was actually suited for briefly without apology and without leaving any ambiguity about his reasoning. He said that the company's problem had been a person in a leadership role who was better suited to a different function, and that replacing him with another person making the same structural error in reverse solved nothing. What Silas accepted was the position of Chief Systems Architect for the Helios program, which came with the authority to structure an independent technical research division, the right to stop any operation that fell below the safety threshold, and the guarantee that no executive directive could override engineering decisions affecting structural integrity. He also requested reduced administrative obligations so that he could continue spending meaningful time on the floor of the testing bay, because the testing bay was where the actual work happened, and he intended to remain close to the actual work. Owen and the 11 remaining engineers stayed on. The language that had described them internally, the team brought in to replace Silas Bennett, was retired from all official communications, and in its place they became the founding cohort of the Helios Technical Division, trained directly under Silas in the operating methodology he had developed over 8 years of testing. Mara Ellison was appointed Director of Safety Assurance with the unilateral authority to halt a project at any phase without requiring executive approval. And every report she had filed over the previous 2 years that had been marked "no action required" was formally restored to the project record with its original timestamps and recommendations intact. At the contract signing ceremony, Rebecca positioned Silas at the center of the table. He gestured for Owen and Mara to stand on either side of him, and he said the thing that was already understood by everyone in the room, but that deserved to be said plainly. Helios 9 had never been the work of one person, and it would not survive the next decade as the work of one person either. That evening, Silas left the facility at the hour he had set for himself in the morning. He drove the 40 minutes home and sat down at the kitchen table where 2 plates were set, and he was there when his daughter came in, and he did not open his bag or look at his phone or carry the day's weight into the room with him. On the security monitor behind him across the darkening campus, Helios 9 ran at its quiet operational load, steadier than it had been in the 8 years since a man with a legal pad and steel-capped boots had first pressed his palm against its housing and heard in its imperfect vibrations the outline of what it could become. The silver ring that had started everything held its correct position, now returned there by hands that understood why it mattered. And the engine, with the patience of a thing built to outlast the arguments of the people around it, simply ran. The most enduring things any of us will ever build are not the ones that earn the loudest applause in the room. They are the ones that keep running quietly long after we have left, because we cared enough to build them right.